Dependency refers to relationship between task, component, or a user story within a Scrum project. Welcome back to my channel where we discuss everything related to Agile methodologies and software engineering. Today our topic is dependencies in Scrum team. Firstly, let's understand what is dependency. Dependency refers to relationship between task, component, or a user story within a Scrum project. There are four types of dependencies. One, sequential dependency. Sequential dependency is where one task needs to be done before the other one can be done, completed, or even started. Resource dependency is when we require a specific resource in order to complete that task. It could be something like a test server. It could be a person who's really overwhelmed with other things that we need him to do a specific task for us, like a DBA. Every team does not have a DBA on board. Majority of the team do not have DBAs as part of the team. So if they need a DBA, they would reach out to a systems team or a database. Then there is functional dependency. Functional dependency is when a specific task needs to be completed in order for another task to be completed or deployed or tested. And then we have external dependencies where we are dependent on other teams or external contractors. Managing these dependencies is crucial for success of any project or product development. By identifying these dependencies early on, we can coordinate, we can plan for these. For instance, if we do not identify these dependencies up front, mid-sprint, whenever we uncover and discover a dependency, and if we have to wait every time for that dependency to be resolved, a simple 6-month project might turn into multi-year project. So identifying these dependencies early on and managing and coordinating them is crucial to success of the project. In this video, we are going to discuss how we can identify these dependencies early on as possible, how we can coordinate and successfully track these dependencies till they are removed. Half of the success of managing dependencies is uncovering these dependencies early on, and the second half is how we coordinate and how we track these dependencies. In the large projects where you're using Safe, where you're using Nexus or less, these frameworks have already processes built into them for managing, for discovering and tracking dependencies. But I'm here talking about smaller teams, smaller projects where they are not using something like Safe or Nexus, or you are using a framework like Spotify, which doesn't have a specific way of tracking dependence. There are two ways that I have used with my teams to uncover dependencies early on as possible. Process one is road mapping. So every organization where we have POs, product owners, they generally create a roadmap. And as a Scrum Master, it is your duty to help them and support them in their role. You should help them organize the backlog, you should help them prioritize the backlog, and you should help them with creating a roadmap. So when you are creating your roadmap, then let's create that with the whole team. In the same way, in Safe, you have a PI planning. Why not sit together with the team and say, these are our highest priority items. How can we plan for these in our roadmap? What order can we deliver them in? And what are the timelines in which they will be delivered? So we can reach to our stakeholders with confidence of when these features potentially will be delivered. So when you are sitting with your team and trying to create a roadmap, then the best way of doing this is use an application, a whiteboard like a mirror. Then take a template from a Safe, then work with your team to take the epic, take the highest priority epic, work with your Scrum team, break it down into milestones, and plot those milestones on a mirror to indicate which sprint they will be worked on. And by doing this, you will also discover where the dependencies are, because you're breaking down the epic. You'll say, okay, before this functionality can be delivered, we are dependent on that team to do this piece of work. So you take a different color sticky on your Miro board and put that in. Now you, with your product owner and with your team, have looked at the epics you're going to be working on in next 4 to 5 sprints. You have also seen what the dependencies are. Now you want to approach the other teams to discuss those dependencies. Before we discuss how you approach the other team, I want to look at this method number 2, and then we'll discuss how we discuss dependencies with the other team and how we track. The other method that I use for tracking dependencies and uncovering them with my team is through epic and feature refinement. Same way as most teams have definition of ready for user stories, I like to have definition of ready for our epics and features. It means that before we commit to any user story within a sprint, we want to make sure that that epic or that feature is fully refined and the team understands what that feature or epic will be delivering. And part of that definition of ready is that we have uncovered and we have discussed the dependency. Other thing that most teams these days use Jira for their product backlog and for the Jira project board. So go ahead and update your Jira template for Epic to put a section in for dependencies. The idea behind this is that when you start to refine those epics in your 3 Amigo session and in your backlog refinement, you will see that field will remind you to look at the dependencies. Either way, if you have identified a dependency in your backlog refinement, in your 3 Amigo sessions, or when you are trying to do your roadmap planning, when you highlight and when you identify a dependency, you as a Scrum Master, you need to do a few steps to coordinate that and to track that dependency. First thing you need to do as a Scrum Master is that you want to say which team are we dependent on, and then you need to go and talk to that team. You want to go and set up a meeting with that team's product owner and the lead dev, the lead engineer, and if Scrum Master joins, that's even better. And with that team, what you want to discuss is you want to tell them what your dependency is. That team's lead engineer will say, these are the changes we need to do in this module, and you'll have your lead dev or engineer there to explain your side of requirements as well. And then you get agreement from that product owner of that team of in which sprint this functionality from their side will be delivered. And you create a user story on that team's backlog for them to work on this dependency and get a commitment of what sprint they're going to be working on. According to their schedule, you want to work on when your team is going to be working on this feature or this epic. Because what you want to do is both of the team to work on this piece of functionality together. You don't want your team to do their piece of work and put it on shelf and wait for them, because when they have completed their piece of functionality and you pick it up, your team is having to do a context switching. You don't want to wait for them to finish their development before you start your development. When your team starts to do the development on their side, they find issues with that team's written code, their functionality. And if they have already done this, then if any changes you need to ask them to make, you will have to wait for them to come back to that, create another user story or a bug in the backlog, and they will come back to that based on their priority. Whereas if both of the teams are working on this in parallel, the engineering working on your side can talk to the engineer working on their side. They can have that discussion. They can test that functionality together, and they can resolve bugs. They can resolve the issues in real time. There is no waiting on each other. There is no lag. So what you want to make sure when the other team is working on completing your dependency, you at the same time your team is working on that functionality as well. Your guys can test their functionality and they can test yours as well. And it might be that when you are using the API to send data over to them, there might be issues the way you are sending it. So when you both are working together, you are able to resolve those together. There's no context switching for you guys, and there's no context switching for the other team. The other thing is that when you have created a Jira on their product backlog, and you have linked that to a Jira on your product backlog, you can track it. Because even though that product owner and that team might have promised you that they are going to deliver that in sprint 4, but due to the capacity and other priorities, they are not able to work on it in sprint 4, and that gets pushed over to sprint 5, then you are able to track it. You want to track their dependencies, and you might want to make that visual. So again, a Miro board is a really good place for this, or even your product backlog in Jira is another place where you can track it. Miro board has a whole dependency template that it has created for safe PI planning that you can use, where you can use a visual way of tracking dependencies if you have loads of them with multiple teams. And in your Jira backlog, you can track the user stories by putting in dependencies between the users, and you can create a dummy user story if you want to track those as well. But the main point is, firstly, you want to discover your dependencies earlier on as possible. You want to plan those with the other team, and then you want to track them, and you want to work on the user stories at the same time as the other team, that there's no context switching within your team or the other team. And tracking dependencies is important, even though that you have created a user story on another team backlog. And if they have hundreds of items on their backlog, when they get to the sprint in which they have promised that they will deliver that functionality for you or will make that change for you, they might forget. So if you are able to, you as a Scrum Master need to track that dependency. You want to reach out to that team before the sprint planning and remind them of the commitment and the promise they made. There's no point reaching out to them after they've done their sprint planning or midway through that sprint to ask them for a status update. Reach out to them before that sprint, remind them that they made a commitment, and after they have done their sprint planning, then reach out to them again and see if they were able to commit to that user story in your sprint, and adjust your plan based upon that as well. So planning and tracking your dependencies is really important. As a Scrum Master, make sure you're on top of tracking your dependencies. By uncovering the dependencies early on, by you as a Scrum Master tracking them and planning them up front with the other teams, you will be able to deliver your product, your project successfully. Please share your point of view of how you track dependencies, any suggestions, any tips that rest of us Agile and Scrum community can use, and please like and subscribe. Till next time, thank you very much.